So this week we're going to be looking at life in Australia in World War I and the impact on the Australian society. So we're looking at World War I and the home front. So World War I had a significant impact on Australian society. A young nation with a population of less than 5 million in 1914 lost over 60,000 young men as a result of the war. Many of these men were the fittest and most able of the male population. As a percentage of total troops sent to war, Australia's losses were the highest of any of the Commonwealth nations. A summary of the numbers of those who served and the numbers of deaths and other casualties makes it clear that Australia made a major sacrifice for the Allied war effort. So if we happen to have a look at the table, right, we sent 331,785. Now, compared to Canada and Britain, obviously, that's actually quite a small number, especially India as well. However, if we happen to have a look at this number and this one, it starts to become a little bit more clear. So, total casualties were 215,585. When compared to New Zealand with 58,000, we've got 140,000 for India, 210 for Canada. Obviously, we're not going to beat Britain, but it's the percentage. So the percentage of our casualties was the highest than all these other countries. And that sort of indicates that 64, almost 65% of of the troops that we sent over were actually harmed in war. So that's not a good number to have. So let's see what happens next. So the initial enthusiasm with which most Australians greeted the outbreak of war did not last. By the middle of 1915, the reality of the war began to dawn. Following the landing at Gallipoli, Australians received news of more than 2,000 deaths. Now, we were only getting a rough guideline of what was happening. We weren't getting the full story. So as a result, after we found out about these deaths and then what was happening in Gallipoli, many in the nation took a more sober view or become disillusioned with war. There was still a strong support for the war and the soldiers that were fighting, but any excitement and that whole idea that war is an adventure had evaporated. So by late 1916, Australia was a bitterly divided country. Not only was there growing dissatisfaction with the war, but a real sense that there was an inequality of sacrifice. Many working class Australians felt that they had contributed the most in terms of enlisting soldiers, and that they were also being exploited at home. There was a perception that the middle and upper class people were less affected by the war, and to be honest, this was actually true. A lot of the enlisting soldiers were from the working class, and that was mainly because it was a steady income. Women would see a soldier in uniform as a better prospect than someone who was just working in a factory, so they signed up. And it was mainly the working class that did. A lot of the middle and upper class actually didn't sign up because they didn't have to. There was no real reason to, unless of course it was going to be in a leadership position or as an officer because they were richer, they could afford it. But it was the working class that paid for it. So some of these upper class people were also seen to be profiting from lucrative government war contracts. These perceptions were not always accurate, but they still had an impact on the growing divisions in the nation, right? You start seeing all these rich upper class getting all this additional money, and you're sitting there trying to work out how much food you're going to have for a family of 5. You are going to really hate that upper class and the middle class.
Australia had been an independent nation for less than 14 years when the First World War broke out. Although geographically remote, the Antipodean nations of Australia and New Zealand wasted no time in declaring their allegiance to Great Britain in its declaration of war against Germany. A standing army of 3,000 men expanded to 50,000 within months. And as Australian men and women ventured overseas on the long and arduous journey toward the various fronts of war, the population at home also braced for transformations that would leave indelible marks on the identity of a fledgling nation, which endures strongly to this day. The wartime contribution of Australians on the home front is a diverse and complex story, one which not only tested to the extreme the character of individual Australian men and women, but also led to major social, political and economic changes in the aftermath of events that shattered and reformed the world at the start of the 20th century.
So one of the ways that they tried to pretty much eliminate that inequity is the War Precautions Act. So in 1914, the federal government passed the War Precaution Act, which gave government increased powers for the duration of the war. This act gave the federal government the legal right to, among other things, monitor intern German Australians, impose a direct income tax, censor letters and publications, and set fixed prices for certain goods. And what you may not know is that during this time, we actually had internment camps. So if you were of German descent, there was a good chance that you would lose your job and sometimes your property, and you'd be sent to a camp, right? They also introduced the income tax during this time. If you happen to send a letter home from the front, there was a good chance that if you were, saying something bad about the war or what was happening, they would actually, cross certain things out so you couldn't read it. And yeah, they could pretty much do quite a few things. They also set fixed prices for certain goods. Think of it like we do with COVID, right? All the shopping centres started to put in certain buying rations. So you could only buy a certain amount of toilet paper or hand sanitizer. So this is something that has happened in order to deal with what was happening at the time. So the impact on the Australian economy. So World War I had a major economic impact on Australia and other nations. The cost of providing weapons, ammunition and supplies to the forces at home and overseas was vast. To meet these expenses, the federal government introduced income tax. It was also necessary to borrow funds from overseas. Australia borrowed heavily from Britain to build vital wartime infrastructure, such as an expanded railways. Australia would take over 20 years to pay back loans taken out during the war. Now, I want you to think about this in comparison to the situation we are currently in. And this will be one of the questions that is in the worksheet. So when you think about it, at the moment, we are in a situation where we have so many people unemployed. And because they're unemployed, we are going to have to start putting extra money into welfare in order to cater for these people who do not have jobs. It's important to do that. We need to be able to provide for them. So we're not actually providing them, providing weapons or ammunition, but what we're providing for the welfare of our nation. The problem is, what's going to happen is all these people who actually do have jobs are going to have to pay extra. So there's going to be there will be, right, increased taxes in order to pay for the welfare spend that we're currently using. So you need to think about it. And it took 20 years in order to pay back loans to overseas, to Britain. But we can't borrow from Britain or America or anywhere else because they're going through the exact same thing we are. So we need to depend on ourselves. And it's going to take 20 years to pay back those loans during the war. It's going to take quite a few years in order to overcome the deficit. So our budget this year, the national budget, is going to be running very, very poorly this year. You wait. So the redirection of raw materials to the war effort and the needs of wartime industries caused inflation. As a result, the cost of living in Australia rose by up to 50% during the war years. The war also disrupted international trade. Naval blockades and the use of shipping for military purposes meant fewer ships were available to move goods to overseas markets. The Australian government had introduced tariffs or taxes on important goods to protect its local wartime suppliers. Many countries looked elsewhere for trade and discovered new sources in Japan and the USA. So, same sort of thing as what's happening now. Our international trade has actually slowed down dramatically. It hasn't completely ceased, but it has slowed down. So that means that things that we would normally buy from overseas companies has actually, dried up. It's disappeared. We cannot buy from them anymore. So one of those places is manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing places, and the one that I can think of at the moment is the caravan industry. A lot of caravans that are built in factories rely on supplies that are from China. And because they've slowed down the trade on those and imports from China, people who worked in factories that used those supplies are no longer in work. And the main reason for that is because they don't have the supplies in order to fulfill those caravans. Can't go anywhere anyway, but they can no longer build them because we don't have those supplies. And this is something that is both good and bad for Australia. Bad that companies that rely on international trade are at a loss, but Australian companies, and this is where we need to be very clever with what we do. The Australian companies can actually do better because they're not competing with international trade. And the problem is we've relied too heavily on international trade that we aren't able to always supply. And that's why people are panicking. We can do it. We just haven't put it into action yet. So, on the positive side, Australia developed new industries, and this is what we should be doing now. The fact that fewer goods could be brought in from overseas meant that inventive Australians began to develop alternatives that were made here. Come on, let's do it. So by the end of the war, 400 new products were being manufactured in Australia. So let's just think how long this actually goes on, how long the international trade is delayed, what good things might actually benefit by us not relying on overseas trade. One new product during the war was developed as a direct result was a medication called Aspro. Now, most of you know aspirin, which is a German-made pain reliever. And during the war, you did not buy German products. And so they, got rid of it. So after the outbreak of the war, the use of aspirin became unpopular and unpatriotic because it was made by the German company Bayer. And you saw that ad there on the right. Throw your impure aspirins into the dustbin and replace them with Aspro. So it's essentially the exact same thing, but they managed to pretty much replace it. Just think of it this way. All the things that we used to rely on at the moment, right? What are we going to replace it with? And that's what a lot of companies and manufacturers are trying to work out at the moment. So Aspro was a big one in the war, right? It was to overcome aspirin. Having said that, aspirin is still pretty popular now. Alright, so there were some people who profited from supplying goods needed for the war effort. These actually included farmers, and at the moment, farmers are doing very well because they have to rely solely on Australian products, right? And Australian fruit and vegetables and things like that. So farmers in World War I were the ones who supplied the wheat, the dairy products and the meat to feed the soldiers here and overseas. Wool was in great demand for soldiers' uniforms, and munitions factories were working overtime to support the war effort. However, Many workers felt that they were not sharing in the wartime profits. So wages fell, but the cost of living rose. So this led to some resentment and even strike action in the coal industry, and on the railways and on the wharves. These strikes drew much criticism. The strikes were described as unpatriotic and selfish, and they were largely unsuccessful. Yeah, we could even say that now, but let's move on. So if we happen to look at that fourth dot point, wages fell, but the cost of living rose. I want you to think about what's happening. You may even want to have a discussion with your parents, right? A lot of people at the moment, so let's relate it to what we're doing now. A lot of people at the moment have no jobs, or they've got reduced hours. And some people even have to live off welfare. And this is really, really bad, because a lot of councils, they're not dropping their rates. The rates remain the same. So even though people are struggling to pay for, basic living costs, the council is not dropping their fees. The cost of food is actually going up because we can't get the cheaper products from overseas. We have to buy Australian, right? So wages are falling or have disappeared at the moment, but the cost of living is starting to rise, and it's going to continue to rise. As soon as they introduce the tax to overcome the welfare and to pay for it, we are going to have a high living cost. So think about it and keep it in mind. So same sort of thing is happening. World War I also happened now, happening in World War II as well. Generally happens when there is a crisis. And we don't need strikers. We just don't. Alright. Women were also impacted by World War I. So with so many men away at war, there was an expectation that women would take on many duties that had previously been the responsibility of men. Women did a great deal of voluntary work, including fundraising and assisting with recruiting. They also moved into previously male domains in the workforce, such as working in munitions factories. In Britain, women were also able to join the armed forces, but only for home defence. And we're talking, patrols and things like that. Women had to take up the roles of men, especially in Australia, because we only had a very small population. And we had sent so many of that population, and they were the young, healthy men, to war. We needed to have young, healthy women to actually take up the slack. So before the war, most women had been homemakers, with a small number working traditionally female roles, such as teaching, nursing, dressmaking, or domestic work. However, with around 500,000 young men off at war, women wanted to support the war effort at home. There was some resistance by trade unions to hiring women in traditionally male roles, as it was thought that this might lower wages. So a lot of trade unions were concerned that if employers hired women would be paid less. That was just what they said. Women would be paid less, and they were worried, the trade unions were worried, that when the men returned, the men would be paid the same amount as women. And trade unions didn't want that. However, some women were able to take on some traditionally male roles, such as store clerks and bank tellers. The government controlled war-related work, and women were rarely able to gain jobs in these areas. The Australian Women's Service Corps was formed with the aim of training women to take over male jobs in the services at home, to free more men to fight overseas. So the job was pretty much, we need to train up the women so then that way it releases the men to go fight. By the end of the war, the percentage of women working outside the home had risen by about 13%. It's not a huge amount, but it's more than what it was previously, and it started a movement. However, there was an expectation after the war had finished that women who had taken on the traditional roles and jobs of men would return to the home, making way for returned soldiers. And this is where a lot of the issues started to come in. Because if you think about it, women had just found out that they're just as capable as men, but were told quite specifically that, when the men return, you are expected to go back to being a homemaker. We don't care that you could do the job. We just care about the returned soldiers and them doing the job. A lot of women started to disagree with this particular thing, and thankfully, there would be women in the workplace now. So, some of the voluntary work that the women had done. So, during World War I, women were strongly encouraged to help the war effort by joining voluntary organisations. Vast numbers of women and girls sewed and knitted to ensure that the troops had warm clothing and raised money to help those affected by the war. The Australian Red Cross was a big one. So after it was founded in Melbourne in 1914, the Australian Red Cross grew to have branches in every state of Australia. Women volunteering for the Red Cross attended working bees where they made packages for the men serving overseas, and these packages included things like soap, toiletries, food, clothing and medical supplies. There was also the Australian Comforts Fund, which hasn't actually continued on, but it probably should at the moment. Hey, start something. So the Australian Comforts Fund was established in 1916. Their main goal was to raise money which they used to provide comfort boxes for the soldiers. These boxes contained things like knitted socks, pyjamas and cigarettes. Maybe. Alright, women are also used in recruitment and, sorry about the picture. So women were also active in influencing and encouraging men to enlist. Some women refused to speak to men who had not enlisted. So if you were staying at home, you would not get any additional women. They would not talk to you. They considered you a coward. And if they considered you to be a coward, they gave you a white feather, which was a symbol of cowardice to men who had not enlisted. Images of women were regularly used in posters published by the government to encourage recruitment. Women were portrayed as helpless and vulnerable victims, and in need of Australian soldiers to protect them from evil Germans. Other women encouraged men not to enlist, though. So Vida Goldstein, for example, was a Melbourne woman who actively promoted pacifism and opposition to war, and formed the Women's Peace Army in 1915. She wasn't very popular amongst a lot of people, though.
Hello, and welcome to our annual ANZAC Day webcast. This ANZAC Day, we brought in historians Kat Joyce, Maddie Turnott, and Maggie DeWillius to discuss Australian women's contributions during the Great War. ANZAC Day is meant to be the day on which Australians remember men and women who served and died in all conflicts. The spirit of ANZAC includes qualities such as courage, mateship, and sacrifice, which soldiers are believed to have shown on the battlefield in World War I. However, since the legend was born from these qualities that male soldiers showed at the Battle of Gallipoli, it largely excludes the role women played. Because women showed great dedication both at home and abroad during the Great War, they should be remembered today as well. Fewer women directly participated in the war effort than men because their place was considered to be in the home. Around 500,000 men left the workforce as a result of the Great War, but women were not chosen to fill these positions. Unions and government restrictions prevented women from holding certain jobs. However, women were allowed to be a part of the Australian Army Nursing Service.
Though this podcast focuses on women on the home front, we would be doing them a disservice if we did not mention the women's efforts abroad. These nurses were devoted to helping war efforts, and some even paid their own way to be involved medically. Women were exposed to many dangers, such as bullets hitting their ships and frequent bombings. Nurses felt consistently rushed as more patients shuffled through with extreme injuries. The nurses would wake up in the middle of the night to dozens of battered and bloody victims, taking on more wounded soldiers at a time than they could handle. These women were functioning on very few hours of sleep while dealing with blind, crippled, and disfigured soldiers. Thousands of soldiers would have died without these women, yet they were never appreciated for their intense labor during the war.
Women also did not receive much appreciation for their volunteer work on the home front. Sometimes schoolgirls who knit the most socks were given mention in the local newspaper, but this was the extent of their acknowledgement. The Rutherglen Red Cross chapter made over 16,000 articles of clothing to send abroad during the war, among numerous other items, including Christmas packages and first aid supplies. Just to make about half of this took the women a combined total of 30,000 hours. Women and girls also organized fundraising events across Australia and created patriotic and pro-enlisting paraphernalia in their communities. Despite all of these contributions, women did not see a major change in status after the war. A quote from historian Jan Bassett sums it up well. Governments had paid lightly for the First World War nurses' service. Most of the nurses, on the other hand, had paid a heavy price for their wartime experiences. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, nearly 20% of nurses were declared medically unfit on discharge and had difficulty reintegrating themselves into civilian life, as they did not receive any therapeutic treatment for the events that they had witnessed. They earned lower wages than males and had trouble finding employment after World War I. Though female employment increased in numbers, as a percentage, it dropped to levels lower than pre-World War I. In 1911, 17.2% of females were employed, but this percentage dropped to 16.33% after World War I.
Despite all their efforts during wartime, both at home and abroad, women did not receive the recognition they deserved upon return and continue to be excluded from the ANZAC legend. Unfortunately, this trend has persisted, which is why we are dedicating today to all of the women who assisted Australian troops either by risking their lives as nurses or sending necessary goods from home. Thank you to all of our listeners, and we have included a list of our sources for the sake of further exploration into the topic because it is very vast and we only had so long to discuss it.
So, this week you'll be required to complete a worksheet which looks at the impact of World War I on Australia and women. This task can be found on Compass Learning Tasks under Week 6, Humanities Distance Learning, and is titled Impact of World War I on Australian Worksheet. You'll need to use this PowerPoint and the internet research to complete this task. For the Enrichment or Extension task, you are to research a female Australian nurse who served in World War I and write a biography about the nurse that includes the following: the name, personal information, where they served, what happened to them, and their overall opinion of the individual. Submit the task in the same Compass Learning task as the Week 6 one on Compass. And just something that I was thinking about in regards to the home comfort box or fund, what would actually be a good idea for current circumstances? What would somebody actually need to be doing or include in a box like that? I was just thinking, off the top of my head, be interesting. Think about it. And here's the references I used this week.